What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner with the Robust Opposition, and welcome to this edition of my show. We're going to do a very good show tonight on DemEnter versus DemExit. And with me are my two guests to discuss that, Alan Minksy, who is the Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America, and Nick Brana, who is a national organizer of Movement for a People's Party. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lauren.
Great to be here.
So before we talk about DemEnter and DemExit, I wanted to get your guys' response to the Bernie suspending his campaign last week. I want to know if you think he made the right choice, first of all, and second of all, what do you think the top 3 reasons for his failure to succeed this time are?
As you know, I did not support him dropping out. Now, I wrote an article that was published a multitude of places, but when it was published and posted on Common Dreams this past week, it was entitled, Stay in the Race, Bernie Sanders, America Needs You Now More Than Ever. I made as strong an argument as I could at the moment to try to persuade him and the campaign to keep going. I do believe that as much as Bernie Sanders' policies were what America needed and absolutely needed before the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, I think they are even more, not only necessary, but they're also more, I suppose the way to put it is digestible for the American public, for the American economy to see their necessity. Somebody had written that reality now endorses Bernie Sanders in the wake of the beginning phases of the COVID-19 crisis, and I think that's very clear. We simply need a very, very strong response from the public sector, from the federal government. These are policies that Sanders has advocated for in contrast to his rivals across the American political spectrum. So I felt it was important for him to stay in to see how the next few weeks and months played out. And I believe all of us who support the campaign could make a case across that time to as to why the public really needed to support a politician like Bernie Sanders to lift us out of the crisis. I thought that was a strong case, and unfortunately, he I woke up the next morning after the article had went quite viral across the country. People seemed to really love it, but obviously, Bernie stopped his campaign. 3 reasons why he ended his campaign. Is that the question, Lauren, or should I throw?
Yeah, that's the question. What do you think are the top 3 reasons that? And it doesn't need to be why he ended his campaign, but why he didn't succeed, why he wasn't able to win beyond California.
Oh, I don't think I could order my thoughts really into top 3. I think the thing that I would begin with is the 2016 campaign and the 2020 campaign contrasted in a marked way along the lines of the degree to which the Democratic establishment, the party establishment, and the various sort of allies out in civil society, most notably the establishment media, treated the campaign. They saw it actually as a very serious threat from the outset, and they put all of their weight into defeating, particular, the Bernie Sanders campaign and the prospect of Bernie Sanders winning the nomination of the Democratic Party. And we saw this really throughout, both in the way the messaging was laid out from beginning with the first debate going forward, but really hit an apex right at the South Carolina primary and what transpired between that and Super Tuesday. But throughout, that was the case. And I think that was as central a reason as any. He is running against a empty suit of a candidate who only really represents the restoration of the Obama administration. I think it has very little to do with the person who ended up getting more delegates than he got. It really was laid out as an anybody but Bernie from the perspective of the Democratic Party establishment. So that's the central reason I see. How do you approach that as a campaign? It was different than in 2016 when it was an upstart, long shot campaign from the beginning.
Yeah.
And we can speak to various tactical errors that may or may not have been made. But, you know, at the end of the Nevada caucuses, I was thinking those people inside the campaign were geniuses and they were pulling it off. And
Yeah.
in 10 days, it didn't feel that way at all.
Well, I feel you, because 4 years ago, I wrote an article the day before he endorsed Hillary that was published in the LA Progressive and in Truthdig called Bernie, Don't Do It.
Yeah.
And some of the things that I wrote in that article were still true today. I mean, all you have to do is substitute the name Biden for the name Clinton. So what is your feeling, Nick, about Bernie dropping out? Were you surprised that he did? And what do you think were the three biggest reasons why he didn't catch on this time?
I think he should have stayed in. I think, you know, even by the rationale of influencing the Democrats, which I mean, I think is almost pointless at this point, you know, because it's trying to get platform concessions. Well, in 2017, the Democratic Party just replaced the platform with a different platform and threw out the one that the delegates passed after fighting them tooth and nail on everything. They passed the better deal, you know, and then they didn't even adhere to that. So the platform isn't like worth the paper that it's printed on, you know, but he should have stayed in the race because he could have been essentially a lead organizer in chief. You know, he was running saying that I'm going to be organizer in chief when I'm president, because that's my theory of change. It isn't just that, like, I'm going to play the inside game. You know, I'm going to try to befriend the other politicians in the Democratic Party that are taking corporate money and then expect them to somehow come around. You know, he said, no, change always happens when you get millions of people, you know, out in the streets, you know, backing the policies that he would have been supporting from the White House. And, you know, that was more accurate. And so I feel like he had a role to play that he had a chance, a historic opportunity to play that organizer in chief role. And I just don't think it made sense to give up his biggest platform and point of leverage to doing that. As far as like why he didn't end up winning, I think there's a lot of reasons. They fall into two categories for me, kind of like Alan was saying. It falls into the categories of things that the campaign did, and then things that the Democratic Party did, you know, to basically cheat him out of it. And I'll talk about like what he did first. I'll mention that he like the basic problem in my mind is that he was not willing to go as far as he did in 2016. He did not, he moderated his language. He wasn't using the terminology of oligarchy anymore. He wasn't grouping the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, together as much anymore. He wasn't, running on like political revolution as much anymore. And so the language and the feel of his campaign changed in those intervening 4 years. And I think that a big part of that, of the reason for that, is that he got closer to the Democratic Party, and he was perceived as having gotten closer to the Democratic Party. And people, the Democratic Party is not popular. It's like that was a negative association that weighed down on him. And you actually saw this in the numbers of the people who came out to vote for him and the way that his coalition transformed from 2016 to 2020. He didn't turn out young people as well as he did before. He didn't turn out non-voters as well as he did before. He didn't turn out rural voters, as well as he did before. And so essentially what you're talking about is his coalition became, a variation of kind of more of the standard Democratic Party, coalition of like suburban or urban voters. And he lost that kind of like really revolutionary appeal that he had, essentially. Obviously, still by far the best, hands down, not taking corporate money, but the image. As we know, so many people just vote based on a feel and an image. And they saw a Bernie Sanders that seemed like he was getting closer to the Democratic Party, that was doing events with Tom Perez, that accepted a leadership position inside the Democratic Party, some made up outreach, chair, which is basically just a figurehead position. And I think that's what happened on the side of his campaign. And then I'll briefly say, what happened on the side of the Democratic Party, even if Bernie had done everything right, all right, even if he had done everything right. And the biggest thing that he did wrong, frankly, is he didn't run against Obama. He needed to run against Obama. And because he couldn't run against Obama, he couldn't criticize Biden. And now we have a nominee who is like who literally has dementia and who cannot, like articulate a sentence anymore. And, and that nominee has not been vetted with any negative ads. And do you think Trump's going to hold back from negative? No, he's already producing devastating negative ads. It's going to be a catastrophe in November. And this is what the Democratic Party has done. And this shows you the degree to which they prioritize and value winning versus maintaining their own internal power in this party. And so these primaries were rigged. They were more rigged than they were before. We put out a press release as MPP in the summer of 2018 when the Democratic Party met at their summer meeting in Chicago, and they wrote the rules. And we said, you know what? Everybody's going crazy about the superdelegates, and there's some superdelegate changes, and they moved them to the second ballot. But we said, guess what? They can just force a second ballot. They have the power to obviate that change, number one. And number two, they can just now have a contested convention as well. And so they can remove that change too. And then of course they started eliminating the caucuses, which is how, all right, I'm being told to wrap up, but I could go on forever. The last thing I'll say is that the Democrats said in the Nevada debate, they put their cards on the table. And they said, every single one of us is willing to stage a convention coup and not pick the candidate that gets the most delegates in the end. Not pick the candidate that gets the popular vote. And the superdelegates, they said the same thing a few days later. And so that shows how far the Democratic Party is willing to go to keep us from power. And it's not just Bernie. This is going to happen forever.
Okay, well, I'm not in disagreement with you, and I'm not one of those hosts that tries to pretend that I'm objective, because I'm not, and I do think the Democratic Party is rotten to the core. I DemExited in 2017.
So then you re-entered for the Bernie
No,
Sanders.
I didn't. I voted for Bernie as a no party preference by asking for my crossover ballot.
With Bernie running in the Democratic Party. But let's continue. Go ahead.
Yeah. And anyway, so let's talk about your organization, Progressive Democrats for America, because I joined it when it was founded in 2004. We had a chapter here in Los Angeles. I used to go to meetings, and the chapter dissolved. Why don't you talk about Progressive Democrats for America briefly, when and why it was founded, and then give your thesis, the most convincing reason why you think after 2 campaigns of Bernie Sanders trying to run as a Democrat, anybody should want to enter that party.
Progressive Democrats of America was founded in 2004, largely growing out of the Kucinich campaign, and it was founded for the purposes of bringing progressives into the Democratic Party. And I think 2004 is certainly one of the points which you can look at as sort of a low point for at least the the strength of progressives inside the Democratic Party. PDA's played a big role in building up progressive strength inside the Democratic Party. We certainly did that in a number of regions of the country in the period up until 2013. Then in 2013, while we had built up our profile across the country, influenced the party across the country, influenced the party nationally, played a role with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, we took an act that undoubtedly was the most significant historical intervention we made in American politics in recent years, in that we were the organization that called upon Bernie Sanders to run in the Democratic Party for president. We launched the Run Bernie Run campaign in 2013 before any other organization in the country. Other progressive organizations were focused upon trying to draft Elizabeth Warren. Arguably, Bernie Sanders himself was focused upon trying to draft Elizabeth Warren for president at the time. And in terms of Bernie Sanders' name being floated as a potential presidential candidate at the time, there was the question as to whether he would run as a third-party candidate or as a Democrat. And there were debates on either side. PDA always took the position that we were trying to draft Bernie to run, and the Run Bernie Run campaign was explicit in calling on Bernie to run in the Democratic Party. So I would argue that with Bernie running in the Democratic Party, obviously our argument proved persuasive. We're very proud of that fact. Bernie ran. It obviously exceeded our expectations. Nick, I think you're getting a message there. Exceeded ours and everyone's expectations in terms of the success of the 2016 campaign. And while Nick made reference to the platform fight in 2016 and the influence that progressives had in the party since that point, we did, with the 2016 campaign, establish a larger beachhead of progressives inside even the National Democratic Committee than we've had previously. As we know, I think she's still gesturing to you, Nick. As we know, we almost won the chair of the DNC. Keith Ellison came very close to winning that election, but didn't to Tom Perez. And then in the 2020 campaign, obviously, we were involved in drafting Bernie along with a number of other organizations, endorsed Bernie again, participated with a number of organizations calling on people to support the Bernie Sanders campaign. And of course, we arrived at the moment just of this week, where Bernie this time, I do think, came closer than he ever did to winning. In 2016, there was a week there after the Nevada caucuses where he had attained a prohibitive frontrunner status with the anticipation that there wasn't a firewall right over the horizon like Hillary Clinton had and understood she had in the southeastern states in Super Tuesday in 2016. There was real panic in the Democratic establishment ranks that Bernie is going to proceed as the prohibitive frontrunner against moderate candidates splitting the votes. We all know the history. Okay, so why, after what we just experienced, would people want to enter the Democratic Party? First of all, I want to make clear for anybody who's watching this right now, I probably share with everybody who would be attracted to a show like Robust Opposition at this hour and this moment, the sense that the Democratic Party establishment treated the Sanders campaign, the Sanders movement, and even to a degree the candidate himself, with the utmost contempt. And I find it utterly reprehensible. I do not have any illusions about the barrier we face with the establishment Democratic Party and who they represent. However, here is why I think people should not disengage from the Democratic Party. And in fact, right now, very much right now, they should get involved in a specific activity of DemEnter, which is continuing to mobilize to get people to vote for Bernie Sanders in the upcoming primaries, to build the number of delegates that are supporting Sanders at the upcoming Democratic convention this summer, however it takes place, virtually or in person. And by the way, I mean, of course, I'm maybe delusional in one regard, I'll acknowledge, which is that, you know, who knows what can happen over the next 2 months, and at least keeps a glimmer of hope alive for somehow things reviving because of the crisis we're in, or maybe because some scandal that could consume Joe Biden or something else could happen that could revive the prospects of Bernie Sanders getting the nomination. I know that's a very, very, very ridiculously long shot. But anyway, DemEnter for the purposes of building delegates. So why continue with it when the establishment of the party has such contempt for our movement? Okay, here's the reasons that I would argue for it. I mean, obviously, there are two wings of it. One is what we're trying to achieve politically at the moment. And the other is, of course, the structure, the long structure of American politics. And I'm sure this is something Nick has thought long and hard about and has a rejoinder to. But let me finish with that obvious broad stroke fact and put it on the table. And everybody knows what I'm about to say, which is that for the past 200 years, since the Whig Party coalesced in opposition to the Jacksonian Democratic Party, we've had a two-party system at the national level in American politics. The only time one party ever of the two parties collapsed, it was instantaneously replaced by a Republican Party, and that's been in place now for whatever it's been, 250 plus years, right? And there have been some parties at the regional level that have had some influence, but the two-party system has never been broken. Why that is exactly, I don't have a very clear explanation for it. I do think that there are strategies for cutting into that. The most constructive one at this hour is, I believe, advocating for instant runoff voting in as many elections across the United States as possible. But even where that has taken place across the country, I don't see it really biting into the two-party dominance. Given then almost the material fact of the two-party dominance, what are we going to do as progressives? Are we going to take ourselves entirely outside of the electoral game? And let me just add this final point. We have a beachhead inside the Democratic Party like we haven't had any time recently. We have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a Democrat. We have the youth of America supporting our candidate in the Democratic Party primaries. And we need right now to have power inside the federal government, inside electoral politics for the purposes of influencing the decisions that are made and how the society is organized. What I would say simply is we are involved right now in a moment in history where the Bernie Sanders campaign opened millions of people's eyes to what needs to happen in the society, which is a full-on social, political, economic reorganization of our society away from what we've been locked into for the last 4 decades, loosely called neoliberal capitalism or post-Reagan capitalism. How that transformation takes place clearly has to be through governmental policy. That's what will achieve the shift that's necessary. That means having significant power inside the government through elected officials who support our positions. The Democratic Party remains the most obvious and simplest path to achieve that, even though the struggle to achieve it through the Democratic Party will be Herculean.
I founded the Movement for a People's Party after working on the Bernie campaign. And so I should probably skip back a little further. I worked for the Democrats for several years. I worked for Terry McAuliffe. I did voter protection for him on his gubernatorial campaign in 2013. I worked for John Kerry in fundraising, arranged donor meetings with him for his PAC and re-election campaign before he became Secretary of State, and became very disillusioned with the Democrats because I said, well, this party's taking money from same corporations, even the same donors often, and the same working with the same lobbyists as the Republican Party, and this is not a real difference. Like, you know, the people who fund the organization are controlling it, obviously. And after that, but when Bernie came around, I was like, all right, in 2016, I was like, got to give it another shot. This was 2015. And so I joined the campaign. I became the National Political Outreach Coordinator, where it was my miserable job of reaching out to the DNC members and trying to get them to support Bernie. And you can imagine how that went. Trying to get corporate lobbyists to support Bernie, 100 of which of them are of the DNC members. And so obviously that didn't work out. I helped Bernie also arrange his political meetings, helped plan a convention towards the end, and then helped him found Our Revolution, was the first electoral manager for that. And that was really the last straw, that experience of working in lobbying the superdelegates for Bernie. Because I realized that the Democratic Party really has no concern. They consciously chose. It was like, I was informing them, others were informing them. Here are the polls. The polls show you losing in Ohio and Florida and Pennsylvania. You know, like, they show Hillary Clinton losing, and you're still going to pick Hillary Clinton. And they show Bernie back then with an even wider lead than he had in the head-to-head polls against Trump, double digits. They chose to lose. Let's make no mistake about that. So a group, myself and a group of other Bernie Sanders delegates, staff, super volunteers, we formed the Movement for a People's Party. And we said, what we really need is we need a major new party, because we need to do the most radical thing, which is we need to do what the majority of Americans are saying they want now. They want a major new party. They say it in poll after poll after poll. Gallup tracks it annually, and it's been above a majority for years now. And increasing. And the same is true with independents. In the number of independents as the major two parties over the past several years have literally been dissolving into independent status. And you now have 40% of Americans, at least, that's on the low end, who are independent, and about 27% each Democrat and Republican. So this has been a long time coming, this political shift. And it gets more incredible, because when you poll the actual Democrats and Republicans, those 27% who said, yeah, we're still Democrats, we're still Republicans, and you ask them, but do you want to be? Half of them say, no, we would rather be in a major new party too. So there's a 40% of independents, and then there's the half of the Democrats and the half of the Republicans who say, yeah, we also want it. We're basically hostages. We're prisoners here. So this is the opportunity that we have now. We've gone through it twice with this election being rigged. The Democratic Party has totally exposed itself, and we've got to make it happen. And the last thing I'm going to say is I'm going to take us through. I really want people to go back to where we were as a movement, as a progressive movement, after the 2016 election, when we said, okay, let's give it a go in the Democratic Party. Let's give it a shot. What were we thinking? We were thinking we're going to replace all the corporate Democrats. We're going to kick them all out of office. We're brand new Congress. That was the idea. The same story essentially. With we're going to completely overturn the DNC. We're going to get Keith Ellison in, and we're going to change that. We're going to reform the party in that way. We're going to change its policies in a meaningful way, not just the platform. And What happened there? They cheated Bernie when he ran. They stole it from Keith Ellison when he went for chair. So let's recap on how this has gone, because it's like, you know, when you're pursuing a strategy, every now and then you have to stop and you have to assess. How is that strategy going? Let's do that assessment now. We didn't get Bernie in 2016. We didn't get the chair with the DNC chair, Tom Perez. We got Tom Perez. Then they kicked members off the national committee. They actually removed them, at-large members. We said, well, let's get on the national committee. And they said, we're going to remove it, you know, some Bernie supporters on the national committee. They put all 30 Clintonites and establishment supporters on the Rules and Bylaws Committee that were in charge of writing the rules for the 2020 election. And they made even worse rules. Big surprise. And guess what? The big Unity Reform Commission that was supposed to change everything, it was just a recommendation. They were submitting recommendations over to the body that was fully controlled, all 30 members.
They did make a change, and I was surprised because I said the same thing you did. I was a delegate at the convention. I actually snuck into the Rules Committee. Barney Frank had it in a very small room so as to keep out spectators. But at one point they were taking a break and the door was open, and I slipped in and argued with Barney Frank, actually. The Bernie delegates were trying to get all their reforms, and the Hillary delegates kept voting them down. And they finally took an adjournment into the room, and I followed them in there, the Bernie delegates, where they were presented with this Unity Reform Commission recommendations. And I was thinking to myself, don't do it, don't do it. You know, exactly the same thing that you said, Nick. You know, Hillary and DNC members make up a majority. These rules are not even binding. You know, they have to be voted on by the whole body. So I was actually surprised when they did get the changes that they did get, you know, on getting the superdelegates off of the first ballot. I didn't think that they would try to do what I think they did intentionally, get all those candidates in there so that Bernie could not get a majority and it would have to go to the second ballot. That was what I thought their original strategy was, until they all, you know, consolidated around Biden. But let me ask you this, Alan, because I'm interrupting you here, Nick, but you know, he makes a very good point about not being able to get personnel change, not being able to get policy change. Why don't you tell me some areas of policy, Alan, that you think the Democrats have been able to get enacted in the last 40 years that has actually helped the lives of working people? Can you think of one or two things?
Okay, first of all, I want to say that my sense is that at the Nevada, post New Hampshire, leading into Nevada, after Nevada, into South Carolina period, they sort of message tested the idea of Sanders going forward with a plurality, with the proliferation of candidates blocking him from getting a majority. I don't think it poll tested well. So I think they shifted their strategy very quickly to the consolidation around Biden. I think they saw they had a total clusterfuck on their hands if they went that route. I think I signaled very clearly earlier that I view the Democratic Party over the last 40 years to have been basically a party that supported the reorganization of American society in ways that supported, you know, the weakening of the public sector and strengthening of the market, the sort of neoliberal shift. Margaret Thatcher said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair's Labor Party. In that sense, Ronald Reagan's greatest achievement was Bill Clinton's Democratic Party. So I'm not going to really point to things over the last 40 years that I think the Democratic Party did very well. Okay, but here's the thing. By the way, I gave a signal that I was agreeing in advance to something Nick said, but he made a different point than I thought he was going to make. I don't know about the utility of creating a third party at this hour in our history. So I obviously disagree. I think the Democratic Party exists. I think we have a beachhead inside the Democratic Party. Look, the greatest achievements of the Democratic Party in the post-war period were, you know, the eventual tortured support of the civil rights movement. Of course, in the 1930s, the New Deal. And if you look at the New Deal and the what transpired there, the Democratic Party is the party that people look to for a more democratic and fair distribution of wealth inside the society than the Republican Party of the two parties. That's why the Sanders campaign is taking place inside the Democratic Party.
Well,
we see that the majority of the Democratic voters are supportive of, or close to a significant majority of, the balance of the Sanders agenda. It can't get passed. That itself is a massive beachhead against the Democratic establishment. And then you look at the shift across generations, we see that the people who are participating in the Democratic Party primaries right now, if just it continues to grow as it naturally would with younger voters right now who are supporting the Sanders agenda, soon you will have such a significant majority of people supporting the Sanders agenda that it would be a critical mass that could take over the Democratic Party. I think it would be tragic if we gave up that specific beachhead at this moment in terms of one of the two parties and not have to go through the extremely risky, I mean, almost like suicidally risky position of basically weakening our capacity to support politicians like Pramila Jayapal, Mark Pocan, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, et cetera, who in a moment of crisis in our society that does resemble the crisis that led to the New Deal, that we don't strengthen our hand in having a say within the halls of power. Now, when worst case scenario, Bernie said, or predictable scenario, we get either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Let's say it's Joe Biden, and he just is an absolute, total pro status quo politician. When the Sunrise Movement then inevitably fills the halls of Congress with protests against Biden's climate policies, when the nurses and PDA and Our Revolution does it because he refuses to accept Medicare for all, we're going to need our allies inside the Democratic Party, both with our relationships with Congress people who will support those positions, of which I think the Congressional Progressive Caucus will. And we're talking about saving people's lives when we're talking about Medicare for all, the necessity of it proven to the public by the COVID-19 crisis. And when it comes to the climate emergency and existential threat, if we have a Biden administration doubling down on fossil fuel investment and fossil fuel export and fracking, et cetera, again, we need a force inside the party to help us all save the planet from that destruction and position ourselves to challenge in the next presidential primaries in 2024 and have a left progressive win the nomination then.
We talked about that 4 years ago, and I don't see that the Sunrise Movement had any effect, and even AOC sitting in with them. AOC is getting very more establishment. I still believe that she supports the policy she supports, but in terms of her tactics, she's not challenging incumbents. You know, she had that PAC where she was going to raise money to challenge establishment incumbents. She's not doing that anymore. So even when she was sitting there with the Sunrise kids outside of Nancy Pelosi's office, Nancy Pelosi still didn't put the Green New Deal on the agenda. She called it the Green New Dream, somehow derisively. And also with Medicare for All getting 70% in the polls, the exit polls, even people who voted for Biden, Biden is still saying that he would veto it. He said that on Jimmy Fallon. If it came to his desk, if it miraculously passed the House and the Senate, he would veto it. So let me ask you a question, Nick. Tell me how a new third party can overcome all the barriers that the two major parties have put up against third parties getting any traction, as well as the fact that we don't have a parliamentary system in this country, which is where traditionally lesser known parties were able to make a difference. So in other words, why would your third party succeed where more established third parties like the Greens and Libertarians and Peace and Freedom failed?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren. But I do want to respond to some of the things that Alan said first, and then I'm going to get into that. And so the first is the idea that, we have a beachhead in the Democratic Party. What beachhead? What personnel? You were pointing this out, Lauren. What politicians? Honestly, it is next to nothing. And even the politicians that we have, they get into the party and they become subject to the structural incentives to moderate. And so you've seen it with AOC, you've seen it with Bernie. This is something that we need to come to terms with. AOC, for example, when she got into office, she occupied Pelosi's office. She said, what we're going to do is we're going to primary the corporate Democrats. We're going to create a corporate free caucus. Guess what? Now she's backed away from both. Now she's backing away from the corporate free caucus and from primarying. So where's the path to victory? Somebody tell me, where is the path to victory inside the Democratic Party? Because it seems like if we're getting cheated out of all the personnel changes, we're getting cheated out of all the elections, and the few people who make it in enter this conveyor belt of the establishment where they get reeled into it, then it seems like there is no path to victory there. In 2018, and I want to emphasize this because where are the other AOCs? We talked a lot about AOC, but where's the rest of them? AOC is very much an exception, and even the fact that she can be subject and Bernie can be subject to these institutional pressures. It's not like character flaws of theirs. This is a sociological perspective. These are institutional pressures acting upon them. And any one of us, regardless of our convictions, would be subject to those same pressures. It is that institution, it's those pressures that we need to dismantle. In 2018, there were how many progressive Democrats actually primaried successfully establishment Democrats and kicked them out of office? 2. AOC and Ayanna Pressley, 2. So that is less than 1% of the Democratic caucus in the House.
I go to Washington all the time and I work on Capitol Hill, and there's simply a massive difference right now in just 2 years' time between the progressive congressional caucus and what it was before and what it is now under Pramila Jayapal's leadership. It's much stronger, it's much more influential, it's much more assertive in its policy agenda, and both chairs endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. You did have a handful of very popular and magnetic young Congress people endorse Bernie Sanders for president this time. Obviously, 3/4 of the squad, plus Ro Khanna, plus the 2 chairs of the CPC. It isn't the CPC that it was just a couple of years ago, so it's stronger there. So there's been some progress there, but it is on the policies. I'll go back to you finishing your point. I want to talk a little bit about what happened in this country during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, and where we are now with COVID-19, and what it means to have politicians like Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal be as prominent as they are right now in light of a crisis that really is going to need some very serious structural responses.
Okay, Nick, why don't you go back to why a third party you think is going to be better? Because you're still talking about the structure, and you're just talking about adding a new party to that same structure.
CPC still takes corporate money, and then the majority of the members do. So I wouldn't say there's substantial change there. And that's like the hard line that I feel like we as progressives have drawn, And so as far as creating a major new party, there is absolutely an opening for that. I shared it earlier. The majority of Americans are saying they want it. People are leaving the establishment parties by the millions. As a progressive movement, in order to turn people out, we have to inspire them. We have to accept that people are not galvanized by the Democratic Party. They have an extremely negative perspective of it. They've lost confidence in institutions across the board, but especially the Democratic Party. 57% majority to 38% in favor of forming a major new party now. How do we tackle the structural barriers? Look at what's happened. Look at what's happening in other countries. In Mexico, in Chile, in Spain, in Greece, in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Brazil. In all of these countries, there are new parties that are breaking through. They are new digitally savvy parties. They are new, they are using different methodologies. They are much more populist. Where the left is succeeding, it is building new parties, and it is going outside the establishment systems. In the United States, we're still here trying to reform an establishment party. That doesn't inspire people. We can do it just like we did in the 1850s. We can split the Democratic Party, and we can pull people from the Republican Party, and we can form a realignment in American politics around working class interests. Because when you look at the figures, just look at the polls of how many people oppose corporate money in politics, it's like 93%. Wow, it seems like there could be like an electoral coalition there that like stepped into that. The same thing with all of these progressive policies. How is that employer health insurance working for you? Maybe if there was a party that actually advocated for Medicare for all with the credibility and its brand name not being totally destroyed and corrupted further. And so if we ran on progressive policies, we could redefine American politics and we could collapse the Democratic Party and replace it, very much like happened in the 1850s. It only took 4 to 6 years to get a majority in the House, from the Republicans replacing the Whigs, and then to electing a president and taking majorities in both houses of Congress.
You didn't really address some of these barriers like the ballot access. Why wouldn't you try to take over a party like the Green Party that already has ballot access in half the states? And, you know, I know that you like their platform. Similarly, Alan, you were 4 years ago working for Jill Stein, so you were all in on that platform. Wait, you have to unmute yourself.
I never worked for Jill Stein except for as a ideas person related to the Green New Deal they were proposing.
But weren't you supporting her campaign for president in 2016?
I had no official public position on the campaign. I wasn't working as an officer for PDA, but no, I didn't have an official thing. I obviously live in California, so the issue is different, but I didn't have a public position because I would have advocated clearly and did advocate for voting for Hillary Clinton in every swing state.
I wrote in Bernie, as it turns out. I was debating between voting for Jill and writing in Bernie, where he was an official write-in candidate on the California ballot. Friends of mine actually made that happen. But Nick, go back to my question about why you wouldn't just try to take over the Green Party.
I know Jill. I know a lot of people, you know, I know people on the National Committee of the Green Party. I know a lot of people before. I actually supported Jill in 2016. But I looked and others looked at how is it that new parties actually succeed. In the 1850s, for example, there was the Liberty Party, there was the Free Soil Party. These were abolitionist parties, just like the Republican Party that ended up replacing the Whigs. They existed for years before the Republican Party came about. But they weren't the ultimate breakthrough parties. The ultimate breakthrough party was a party that came about at the right political moment. It came about at the moment when, in the election of 1852, the Whig establishment had forced through a very unpopular candidate. It's a very unpopular platform of slavery, essentially. It's to continuing to support slavery. And that's when what precipitated the split that in 1854 led to the formation of the new Republican Party, abolitionist Republican Party. So it's that same model. It takes something new, it takes something fresh, something that people believe, this has inspiration and traction. And that's the same model that's working abroad.
Yeah, I'm not really in a mood to argue, to make points against the points Nick's making. I'd really rather stick to making the very difficult case at this hour on a week when so many people who undoubtedly make up our audience right now are hurting over the suspension of the Sanders campaign, make the case for why people should remain inside the Democratic Party. But let me just point out a couple things there from what Nick said. You're talking about building a working class party in the United States that's a third party. I don't know how you're going to do that without having union support. And and I know how locked into the Democratic Party almost all American unions are. Oftentimes tragically so, especially in their support of neoliberal candidates, but they are, and good luck overcoming that. Then secondly, just again, Bernie Sanders, what he built in the Democratic Party, again, the beachhead I've described versus Nader and what happened to the Green Party in the wake of Nader's campaign in 2000. And obviously Nader generated an incredible amount of enthusiasm throughout the summer of 2000, which, by the way, at the time I did enthusiastically support. In light of that, I think that was one of the big things that informed the founding of PDA in 2004, very conspicuously, 4 years after the tremendous enthusiasm around the Nader campaign and the need to just double down and accept the two-party system as tragically a material reality in American society and fighting within the Democratic Party. Again, I really want to point to what it means to make the changes that have to be made in our society right now. I do think they are very broad things. I do think that in terms of any belief that neoliberalism can produce the prosperous middle-class society that was the American social contract coming out of World War II and for decades, it's going to take a readjustment of the structures of American economy that are going to require, basically state reorganization of the economy along the lines of what Reaganism did and the Reagan Revolution did, except back in the opposite direction, to create a social democratic economic contract here in the United States, one that is in some ways organized like the New Deal and the American economy was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like Western European countries were in the post-World War II period, except of course more inclusive than they ever were in the American context before. I think that's what the Sanders agenda is about at its core. And it requires to have political influence and majority political influence in the state, at the state and local level, but primarily at the federal level. And the easiest pathway there is to win majority support of the Democratic Party. I think we have come close twice now. I agree that Bernie Sanders, look, it's difficult. It is difficult. It's even difficult down to the point that I actually do believe that Bernie Sanders, there are some singular things about Bernie that prove that he was an incredible vehicle for achieving this incredible groundswell of support for politics that probably all three of us have embraced now throughout our adulthood. But and so who comes next to carry that in the next presidential campaign? Of course, right now, I'm still hoping we build up delegates and achieve something right now. But we are also in this crisis. And we also have to be honest about what we had in 1932, 33 and the New Deal coming forward. That was a revolutionary transformation of the relationship of the government, of the federal government to American society and American economy. Franklin Roosevelt was not a radical left politician, okay? It was achieved. Now, the labor unions were strong then. Now what we have that's stronger are the kind of civil society movements that have been adjuncts to the Sanders campaign. But right now, we are going to be in a public health and economic crisis, the likes of which certainly is a very short-term thing that's hit. We don't know how long out it will last, but we have no reason to believe it'll be so short-term that we won't have an opportunity to advocate for what we know would be best for the society coming out of this, which is a reinvigorated New Deal. It can be a Green New Deal, which would bring, again, people like the Sunrise Movement along with us in our alliance. And that requires right now engaging the Democratic Party.
Okay, well, let me address that. I was going to bring in my point of view at the end of the show, but since you're bringing this up, I have to jump in right now. During Occupy, I became a big fan of Chris Hedges. And Chris Hedges says that all of our institutions are broken. His book, Death of the Liberal Class, says every institution, whether it's the media, the Democratic Party, the clergy, every institution that was supposed to represent us is corrupted. And he called for mass nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's why the Occupy movement resonated with me, because it was about the 99% versus the 1%. It wasn't about all this woke identity politics, pitting every interest group against each other. We got sucked into Bernie's campaign, and I joined it because I thought if Occupy believed in electoral politics, if they believed in candidates, Bernie would be their candidate. And I worked my butt off for that campaign for like a year, past a year actually, then got involved in issue campaigns, because my feeling was we got so many people involved in the Bernie campaign through his issues. Those issues didn't go away. So a lot of Bernie people became activists for Medicare for all, banning fracking, racial justice, the whole 9 yards. But now what we see, you talk about this pandemic and you talk about the Great Depression. We are having conditions in this country that we have not had in 100 years. And I really feel that Bernie Sanders should not have suspended his campaign. He should have actually left the Senate. First of all, he should have voted against that corporate bailout. It was a despicable bill. And had he not been running for president, he most probably would have voted against it. It would have been like all of his other lone courageous votes that have gone down in history as being the right way to vote. But he put lipstick on a pig on that thing, and I was just horrified by that. He should have quit the Senate. He could have taken his whole movement, and there's still a chance to do that, because right now the teams, the Slack teams that do texting, that do emailing, that do phone calling, they are trying to get him to keep that movement together under the leadership of certain people and his staff, notably Claire Sandberg, Becca Rast, other people, so that they can fight for his priorities in the Senate, in Congress. But what I think he could be doing, and this would be super bold and super meeting the moment, is leading a rent strike first, then a student debt strike, and then a general strike, because we're going to have 25 to 30% unemployment in this country. We've got a time when everybody's staying at home. We can organize in Slack. We can organize with conference calls. We can do all the texting, the emailing, the calling of the people. And Bernie should be leading that. I mean, you know full well, Nick, because we were having these conversations 4 years ago. People need to follow a charismatic leader. When I went to the Left Forum in 2015, I heard Winnie Wong and Charles Lenchner speak about People for Bernie. And they were saying there's two types of activists. There's the consumer activist that just votes every 4 years, and the entrepreneurial activist, which is people that, fight fracking or fight the TPP, things that I've done. So they thought that People for Bernie could marry those two types of activists. And you see that now. You see people that just want to make calls. They just want to send texts. And that structure is there. And if Bernie Sanders throws that away, he criticized Obama when he disbanded OFA. Remember, saying he had built up the largest people power organization that has ever been seen in American politics. Bernie now has that. And I think he's squandering it to go back into the Senate and fight for some crumbs in phase 4 of the next corporate bailout. So your thoughts, both of you, on that?
People have been calling for him to do this, frankly, from the middle of March. They've said, transform your campaign into a emergency response vehicle against COVID-19 and fight for, Medicare for all. I mean, if there was ever a better time, to do that and fight for universal basic income and take a stand in the Senate, in the House, demand those recorded votes, demand the inclusion of these provisions. And there's absolutely more that he could have done and more that he should be doing in terms of doing that right now. And it's a gigantic opportunity. And it was an even bigger opportunity when he had the platform of being a candidate. After Bernie dropped out, we said we were going to host basically an emergency call about, what are the next steps as MPP. Almost 400 people joined that call with less than a day's notice, and 900 people had registered. I looked at Google search trends, DemEnter versus DemExit. Before we got on, DemEnter doesn't even register. Millions of people are actually leaving, doubting, questioning the corporate parties. And I think, why are we as a progressive movement swimming against that populist current by trying to contain and hold people in an establishment vehicle? Why aren't we going with them? Why aren't we doing what they're saying? When the momentum is out of the party, when the majority of Americans want a major new party, why are we the ones as progressives who are fighting to prevent that from happening?
Well, I'm not even talking about a party at this point. I think a party is very small bore. I think both of you are talking about staying in the party, starting a new party. I'm saying we need a real revolution. And more than a political revolution, we need an economic revolution. We need to overthrow capitalism in this country finally, because capitalism isn't working for anyone anymore. And what FDR did, he didn't do because he cared about the people. He did it to save capitalism. Everybody knows that.
I do think that a general strike is something that obviously also is becoming very popular and spoken about, and we'll have to see where things go in terms of that. And again, what I do think that the role that PDA would play in that context, if something like that gains a significant degree of traction and people build towards it, is to advocate on the inside when that's on the outside. And we always encourage the growth of left activism on the outside. We don't think we get anywhere on the inside without the growth of left activism on the outside. So I had been intending to bring up the prospect of a general strike in my notes, but you beat me to it, Lauren Steiner.
Well, great minds think alike, okay?
Nick's enthusiasm for what he's talking about is of course magnetic, and I appreciate it, and is a very powerful moment to make a case for DemExit. And also, I know so many people who, like Nick, have had analogous experiences inside the halls of power with the Democratic Party. I have my own story that I've been sharing with people now that Biden looks like the presumptive nominee around my relationship to progressive economists in 2008. I actually was with James Galbraith, who'd been a counselor to the Obama campaign in 2008, and fully expected that he would be named to the economic team in the Obama administration. I was with him the weekend the list came out, and it was a complete shunning. And the people I do know who tried to engage the Obama economic team at that point, which is made up of, Rubin and Summers and their likes, they just got a cold shoulder. They were shut down. At the very moment that they had come in to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, the world was hoping for something of a much better deal out of the Obama economic team. So I've had that experience too. It's very real. The Democratic Party establishment, look, the party is split. I mean, there are many different factions, but there are roughly two large factions right now inside the Democratic Party. And right now, there's no doubt the establishment is holding on to power. And at this hour, that remains the case. And I do not think they're going to give in anything that we do not take from them, or next to nothing. So I hear you entirely on that. I just think that we need to stay engaged in, it's a very difficult hour to make the case for DemEnter, but I really think it's an important moment to make the case for DemEnter, not only to build up the delegates, but to understand that we need to have a voice inside the halls of power at this very potentially transitional moment in American history, and to demand our demands, to make our demands.
How many members and chapters do you have? How many states do you have these members and chapters in? How do you define a member? Is it somebody who pays dues, somebody who takes an action, somebody who is on an email list? Let's start with you, Nick.
So we have more than 60,000 members now. It's probably around like 62. And we define that as people who have signed up with us, which has exploded recently. We have, I don't know, I think it's 300 people in our Slack now.
In the last 4 years, I haven't seen any California chapter of, Movement for a People's Party, nor have I seen any new Progressive Democrats of America chapters started here in California. So that's what I wanted you to speak to in the last 4 years, since you're very convicted in your, philosophy, what you've been doing to grow your movement. So I guess you can answer the question about state chapters, Nick, and then we can go to Alan.
We have few chapters, and so the chapters that we have are ones that we're building right now. We have hundreds of people who want to build chapters now, who've signed up for that. And so that's really something that we're going to dive into now. In terms of California, we've had one in San Francisco, but yes, it's been hard to maintain chapters. Absolutely, during Bernie's campaign. I mean, everybody was interested in being a part of his campaign, and I think that's understandable. And I want to say, like, a bigger point is that it was also understandable to want to give the Democratic Party a shot. Like, the structural barriers that Alan has outlined well, that you've asked about, Lauren, those are real, and it's not like they don't have to be overcome. But at this point, the balance between them is certainly in favor of starting a new party.
We don't have members. PDA, our parent organization, remains a 527 federal PAC, and they don't have members. They have supporters. We call them supporters or activists. We have a whole different set of array of email lists. If you add them all up, we got about, I don't know, they overlap. So it's somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000. The PDA core number of activists and supporters is about, last count was about 77,000. And they, of course, are in all 50 states and across the world, and in all the nooks and crannies of, Puerto Rico and DC and places that aren't called states. And chapter maintenance is tough, by the way, Nick. It's a real tricky thing. I think all the organizations experience that. Of course, DSA is doing great with their chapters right now. We have about between 60 and 80 chapters across the country. We're in 30 states with chapters. Again, we have activist supporters in every state. But PDA in Southern California is strong, in San Diego, Orange County, up in the Santa Monica Mountains. We now have a new chapter out here in CD 34, and we're restarting the general LA chapter. So, and we're also in the Valley.
So more about mechanics. The Republican Party has been very good at starting with local races. I mean, down to school board elections. They go for school board, they go for city council, they go for state legislature. It's been my observation that people, especially Bernie-crats running, they want to go straight for Congress, straight for that federal office. What has your organization been doing to try to encourage people to get involved in these local races? A lot of these local races are nonpartisan. So a Movement for a People's Party candidate, for instance, can run and be elected to something. And then as that person moves up the ladder, in their political career, then they can, maybe by then the party will have been established, ballot line, So what are you guys doing with regard to local offices? Because I think the Republicans have a better handle on how to take power by doing that?
So right now we're focused primarily on building the movement, because this is the time when we think that we need to consolidate around creating a major new party. As far as the electoral work that we're doing right now, it is making sure that we have all of the legal requirements to get on the ballot in all 50 states, and that we have the party formation basically processes there. And that's a process that we've almost completed.
PDAers run for office at all levels. We have people who are core activists running for a bunch of city councils across the country and such. A few that are running. We have one who's running for Congress right now, one of the insurgent Democrats, and actually Arizona is a core PDAer there. But we also have a lot of people who of course run for positions within the Democratic Party, and that's a lot. And of course we have a ton of them who have stood up to be once again Bernie delegates this time.
Okay, so my next question revolves around labor, because Alan, you alluded to that. Labor used to be a lot stronger in the 30s. The Socialist Party used to be a lot stronger in the 30s too. But now we have a situation with labor has become part of the establishment, and you have unions like the AFT with Randy Weingarten, who, much to the consternation of the rank and file, endorsed Hillary over the views of her members. And this year, I don't think they endorsed before Bernie, well, maybe they endorsed late in the game, but before they had endorsed, Randy Weingarten indicated that she personally was endorsing Warren. And this is after Bernie has supported teacher strikes, had her on his stage, and teachers were the most the largest profession that gave to Bernie Sanders. And here, our teachers union, Alex Caputo Pearl, Los Angeles, they made a big show of endorsing Bernie early, hopefully to influence their parent union. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And we've got unions like the IBEW here in Los Angeles, protesting Eric Garcetti for supporting the Green New Deal and supporting Republican candidate John Lee over Democrat candidate environmentalist Lorraine Lundquist for city council. Nick, I know that you've been trying to do a lot of coalition building in the last 4 years, and you've been reaching out to unions. So what has your experience been with unions? I mean, do you think by and large we have more establishment unions than progressive unions? And what is it going to take? Because after all, we're talking about we're talking about organizing working people. And I find it ironic that the vessel that has been used to do that has gotten so establishment and is more concerned with their own sort of salaries and benefits than they are with improving the lives of working people in general.
And that's why you see so many wildcat strikes. Labor, as far as it comes to building an independent party, is largely in the hands of the Democrats, but it's not a monolith either. There are people, including people in leadership positions, who are not happy. And as many know, there was even an effort to organize an independent party, the Labor Party, in the 90s. And so there is a current inside labor. It's not as big as or out of the control of the kind of business unionism as most of the unions are, but there are some unions which are interested.
Well, I mean, I think it is a matter of working with the rank and file and the movements inside various unions to try to have leadership challenges inside the unions, especially where there's an appetite for more progressive leadership, where I think there is across a number of unions in the country. So I think that's something that, of course, PDA and our allied organizations like Our Revolution, we look to, and to try to, again, throw our support whenever we see challenges from the left inside labor unions. And of course, we're partners with the nurses. They're a fantastic labor union and really groundbreaking in their activism. And of course, just incredible love and solidarity to all the nurses out there right now because of what they're going through.
Do you think that either of your strategies, either getting progressives to enter the Democratic Party or or getting a new party can work that is dedicated to the people if we can't get rid of the outsized influence of money in politics and overturn not just Citizens United, but also Buckley versus Vallejo, which is a 70s era decision that says money equals speech, and politicians like Bloomberg and Steyer can spend as much money as they want on their campaigns. So we're certainly not anywhere near overturning those decisions or getting public financing of campaigns.
Well, again, I mean, I think PDA's position, you can imagine what it is. We're for full-on publicly funded campaigns and every kind of regulation that can be achieved so that working class people can run as effectively as Michael Bloomberg can run. And obviously, we would need to have this be legislated and also to support judicial appointments that would back it up in the courts.
The internet is a game changer. The internet made Bernie's campaign possible. Bernie entered the race in 2016, and I think you started to answer your own question, Lauren. Bernie is the evidence that it's possible. Bernie entered the race in 2016 with 3% name recognition nationally. You know, there was an anointed candidate. DNC was totally against him. You know, media was totally against him. And yet he caught fire. And had it not been for Democratic Party cheating, he probably would have won in 2016, you know, just like he would have won in 2020, the nomination. And so it goes to show that when people get frustrated to a certain extent and they lose confidence in their institutions, there's a tipping point. There's a tipping point where you can throw $1 billion, Mike Bloomberg, at people, you know, and it just doesn't make the difference anymore because people are fed up with that and they stop listening to, you know, basically what's being said. And that's the potential, you know, that a new party has as well, is that it doesn't have to compete on a level playing field. And in fact, we shouldn't even aim to compete on that. You know, even though Bernie's campaign has proven that we can compete in that arena by small dollar grassroots donations and recurring donations. So it is possible to do. But the arena where we're going to win and where we're going to have credibility as an independent party, as a people's party, is in our integrity, where we say that our politicians voluntarily do not take big money and they avoid all of the, you know, the revolving door, all of the mechanisms of influence.
This show is not to talk about what we need, it's to talk about how we get it done. And my question about Bernie was leading into my second question about the media, which is that he did raise the most money of all the candidates except the two billionaires with small dollar donations, but yet he still couldn't overcome the negative smears of the mainstream media. Now, social media was great for his base and for young people who use it, but it does not have any effect on average voters. And ultimately, I think with all the mistakes in the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I will be writing an article with my perspective on that, I do feel the number one factor was the mainstream corporate media. So until we build up indie media, which is struggling, even the mainstream media, there's been articles about how during the pandemic, so many newspapers have laid off people and are shutting their doors because the business model of advertising just isn't working anymore. So how will you overcome the corporate media who will smear your candidate, Alan, your progressive Democrat, and your candidate, Nick, your People's Party candidate, because they will threaten the interests of their corporate owners and their corporate advertisers?
It's obviously a huge question because it hasn't been overcome. And I do believe that as you look at the Democratic Party establishment, basically somebody described MSNBC as a Democratic Party establishment PAC effectively in this last election cycle. I do think there was a very vibrant alternative media readily found on YouTube of a number of shows that were very supportive of Bernie Sanders. Certainly no other campaign had anything like it, from the Young Turks to Crystal Ball on the Rising to Sam Cedar, Michael Brooks, Benjamin Dixon, et cetera. There's a whole media landscape filled with these shows that are gaining popularity, and they have incredible persuasion for younger voters, but they, in the end of the day, they really seemed weak compared to the influence of MSNBC, CNN, the major papers, establishment papers. So it's something that has to be strategized about. The independent media has to be strengthened. The platform has to be lifted. And, probably a better coordinated effort to achieve getting the word out about those other new alternative media sources. And maybe those sources also themselves should have tried more strenuously to insinuate themselves into the election by having Bernie on, inviting all the candidates on, et cetera. But again, it's something that has to be achieved and it's work to be done.
I think those shows, some of them wanted to have Bernie on, and I think the Bernie campaign didn't go on them. After the 2016 election, I think that, going back to what I said about how Bernie took off, despite the fact that he had no media, every institutional force and supposedly deciding figure of success was against him. And yet, he took off, and it was largely because of social media, again, the internet. And it was people self-organized. They actually started, they started state chapters and organizations, and they had like field organizers and networks in states that were literally organizing for Bernie before the campaign got there. It was remarkable. And in some cases, they even crowdfunded field offices to open up their own offices. So after the 2016 election, the establishment very much recognized the power of social media, and it waged a campaign against social media, and that was a fake news, basically meme. And the objective of that was to shut down independent discourse and to give themselves a pretext to clamp down on the independent media and the social media that had emerged. And anyone who's in the independent media or does organizing in like a progressive space on digitally can feel it. The algorithms, they have changed the algorithms on Facebook, Twitter, other platforms, YouTube, to suppress independent content. And that's not an accident. And the more independent, you are, the more they've done that to you. They unsubscribe people, they do shadow banning. So, towards like, how can we overcome that? Look at the channels, despite all of that. Okay, despite all of that kind of retribution for the 2016 campaign, the way that social media powered the populist candidates, Bernie and Trump, that look at the platforms and the channels that have most explosively grown recently. And that is the Jimmy Dore Show, up to 700,000 subscribers. And that is rising, which has gone from a few thousand subscribers to almost 400,000 now, and has just an enormous following. And both of those channels, something that actually is a factor in both of those, is that they are very much, they take a very antagonistic position towards the Democratic Party. Both of those channels have said, have taken never Biden positions, basically, and have said, you don't owe the Democratic Party your vote. And the way that progressives exert power wherever it is by showing that nobody owns their vote. Votes are earned. And so for them to be taking that position and for those channels to be the most successful, I think tells you something about where people's minds are now. Just like the fact that DemExit, never Biden, never Trump, all of these have been trending nationally several times over the last few weeks.
Okay, well, let me mention something to you, that those independent channels, which I watch and support, are just progressive version of the mainstream media, MSNBC and CNN, which focus on the horse race. And I think we need more channels that focuses on the issues and that focuses on activists and activism. And we faulted the mainstream corporate media, not focusing on the issues, not telling people how horrible neoliberals, both Democrats and Republicans, have made their lives. So I'm gonna, just before the show ends, I was gonna do this at the end, but I'm gonna tell people now, because I've never had such a large audience watching this show, that I've been doing a lot of shows during this pandemic because everybody's home. I focused on the activists who are trying to release the prisoners and the detainees from our jails and detention centers, which are powder kegs waiting to explode in this pandemic. I've had Zach Carter on, who is the economics reporter for the Huffington Post, talking about what a horrible corporate bailout we just had and what a people's bailout would look like. Tomorrow night, I'm having on Shahid Buttar, who's challenging Nancy Pelosi, who I would love to see get voted out of office. She's been such a deterrent to our progressive agenda, but he's going to be speaking about his specific expertise coming from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is how the government is capitalizing on this pandemic to start taking away some of our civil liberties, which is very important that people become aware of that. Tuesday night, I'm having Chris Smalls, who is the Amazon worker who was fired for blowing the whistle on the horrible conditions at the JFK warehouse in New York, crowded and unsanitary conditions. He's coming on with one of his colleagues. Wednesday, I'm having on a guy by the name of Jim Lardner, who writes for the American Prospect. And he did an amazing expose called Mapping Trump Corruption. And he went into every office and every department and every regulatory agency to show what Trump has done there. And I feel like if the mainstream corporate media and even the Democratic Party in their impeachment trial had shown the American public this, then we probably could have gotten him impeached instead of focusing on that stupid, Ukraine gate BS. And finally, on Thursday night, I'm having Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer for Jacobin. He just wrote a book called Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And he's been on my show before. He's a great writer. So these are my shows. I'm doing them at 6 p.m., which is an hour early, 6 p.m. Pacific time, because after all, we're home all day. I used to want to wait till LA, California people got home from work, but we are all home. So that's just a plug for my upcoming shows. And now I want to see if anybody put any questions into the chat. But while I look for that, I want to find out what you guys think about the vote blue, no matter who. Unity, we need unity, and we need to vote for Biden because Trump. Are either of you two planning to vote for Biden? I'm not.
PDA has an official policy that we only support candidates who are caucusing with the Democratic Party or Democrats. However, we endorse only progressives. So that's what we'll be doing. We do, however, when the primaries are determined and we are set with the Democratic slate running for Congress and the Senate and also state legislatures and governors across the country, I especially want to point out to people that this is a census year election. It is a top of a decade election. That means it's the election that's going to determine the writing of the districts across the country. So we will be making a special effort to alert people to make sure that they vote. In this instance, blue no matter who, across state legislatures and governors, but we will be endorsing specific progressive candidates across the board, across the country at specific PDA locals and PDA nationally. Only the people who fit with the Sanders agenda will get PDA endorsements.
MPP has an official policy that we only support candidates that don't take corporate money and that support Medicare for all and that support free public college and that support a real bailout in this situation where people are hurting so much and that support UBI. And so that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm not voting for Biden. And it appears from those trending figures and those Google search figures that there are millions who aren't either. The Republican Party, the Democrats are letting the Republican Party become the populist party in this country. They are letting Trump get to the left of Biden again on issue versus over issue.
Yeah, what happens if Trump puts everybody on Medicare? What if Trump's the one who?
It's over.
It's over. Medicare for all is a political landslide winning issue right now, and it's absurd.
It's over.
And PDA we will no doubt be organizing petitions demanding that the Democratic Party adopt it as part of the platform, and that Biden, if he's the nominee, adopt it as part of his platform. Do I think that Joe Biden and the Democratic establishment would ever really push for it? Whatever's in the platform or whatever Biden says on the campaign trail, I'd be skeptical. But I can see the moment where Biden is asked in a debate with Trump about Medicare for all, and he gives his little answer about lowering the age down to 60, and then Trump shrugs and goes, "Yeah, I support it," and that's it. election over, Trump wins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
And Biden said he was going to veto it.
you were very smart, Nick, when you wanted to draft Bernie for a People's Party. That was the original name of your group, because you felt that only somebody with a following the size of Bernie could pull something like this off. But then, of course, when you had been working for so long and it became clear that he wasn't interested, your membership forced you to say, no, let's start a People's Party anyway. That really was not your initial strategic decision. So you've been trying
And
to
they were right.
Occupy. It was called a leaderless movement, but inside we said we're all leader. It's really a leader-full movement because everybody can be a leader. But that doesn't always work out in practice because you have these sort of competing egos. And maybe it works out if you're trying to do an event, or if you're trying a single campaign, like let's get Eric Garcetti not to fund 3 aging gas plants, which we were successful in doing last year. Or let's get the supervisors to cancel the contract to build a mental health jail. Those kind of things we can put together coalitions very easily to work together. And also because they're local, people are more connected to their local officials. They can influence them easier. But on something major, like a national, like a rent strike or a student debt strike or a general strike, how do you see somebody organizing that if not Bernie and his already built organization?
Well, at MPP, our theory of change is actually one of a movement party. So we don't think it's enough to do electoral work alone either. And so we are doing direct action work. We have that as one of our working groups, and civil disobedience and mutual aid, and simply working with organizations in their community, building coalitions and modeling the kind of society that we should have.
Certainly, I'm networked in with a whole range of different organizations and activists. I can't imagine that, for instance, something like a general strike or any of those actions that you described earlier, Lauren, would take place without obviously the folks in DSA having a big hand in that or being highly cognizant of it. And we're aligned with DSA in a number of movement, coalitions, and I work closely with them. And so, we would be alert to it, and then we would, of course, support them. And we would, of course, try to bring the demands into the offices of progressive members of the Democratic Party who hold office, and all members of the Democratic Party. So we would be fully supportive. And I don't know how these things will go forward. I mean, obviously, you just probably have to do research on hashtag general strike and try to figure out where it is. But certainly some of my closest political allies across the country are already involved in thinking about that. Well,
in Occupy, I learned the term diversity of tactics. And I learned that Occupy could also be described as reform, resistance, and reconstruction. Reform meaning the kinds of things we're talking about: overturn Citizens United, restore Glass-Steagall, ban fracking. Those are all reforms. Resistance being the kind of protesting that we're doing out in the street. And reconstruction meaning let's build the kind of world we want to see. Do community gardening, do solar power, things like that. So I think we need to be throwing everything in the book against this problem, which is so big and so existential, really. I mean, we knew that the climate crisis was an existential threat. Unfortunately, the world governments don't see it like that, and they're not taking the appropriate action. They seem to be taking the appropriate action for the pandemic. So let's see if we can use Naomi Klein's shock doctrine to try to get them to do some of these really big structural changes that we've been talking about, such as a Green New Deal infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, which are what, Trump and the Democrats are talking about. Actually, a Green New Deal infrastructure project, or finally getting Medicare for all, not just like when Bernie said he thought we could not get Medicare for all into this 4th phase bailout. Why not? All he's asking for is that we get people covered, by Medicare for their coronavirus treatment. How is that fair to cancer patients or patients with heart disease? I was just so disappointed when he said that. If now is not the time to ask for these things, when will be? So I'm going to leave it on that rhetorical question, and I'm going to Thank you both very much for being on my show. Thank you for watching. Please share the show. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. So I will give you each an opportunity to say goodbye, and one more last thing before we close the show.
It was worth a try. It was worth a try in the Democratic Party. But at some point, you have to assess how successful a strategy has been. And in terms of all of the changes we've sought, getting the candidates, getting the changes in the rules that enable the candidates, getting the elected officials, getting them to stay to their principles, actually adhere to that. None of it has changed. None of it has changed. The corporate politicians, even who are running against Bernie, backed away during the primary for Medicare for all, for example. They were actually regressing. Biden's proposed, his olive branch to the left now is worse than what Hillary Clinton was talking about. He's talking lower Medicare, age to 60. Hillary was talking about 50, 55. We're going in the wrong direction. And if there ever was a moment to make this change, it's a moment when we're in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic meltdown and a rigged primary election, American presidential election. This is the time to make the change.
Look, I don't want to dampen Nick's enthusiasm, and if it is achieved, it will be a glorious, glorious transformation of the American political landscape. However, we know the recent history of. Thank you for the invitation, Nick. But I also encourage Nick to not lose sight of the struggle within the Democratic Party, given the history of third parties in the United States of America, the consistency at which 200 years running, we have a two-party system here in the United States. We need to have progressive voices determining and influencing public policy. That requires engagement and maintenance inside the Democratic Party, and even a continued policy of DemEnter. So I encourage everybody to stay fighting inside the Democratic Party, as well as remaining active outside the Democratic Party. I do believe the part inside the party is necessary right now. We are in a very transformational, historical moment. We have the opportunity through moral suasion and activism, including direct activism, the type that Lauren has referred to, that we can demand serious changes of our politicians at this hour. And I do think we have significant allies, from Bernie Sanders to the people who endorse Bernie Sanders and a few other progressives inside there in the federal government, that we can call upon to stand with us to create a powerful bloc to demand progressive change. They have to be more, we have to be more, and we have momentum on our side over the last 5 years. And I think we have to keep building and hopefully take over the Democratic Party in the very near future. Thank you.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm going to end the show and let people know that I am going to be putting the petition to Bernie to keep his organization going into the comments. But I want everybody to stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting.